Tonight, the agreement gets real.
Maybe it doesn't do everything for everyone, but this is a step in the right direction.
Lawmakers in the House prepare for a vote on the debt limit deal, 6 days from a new default deadline.
There's no reason why it shouldn't get done by the 5th.
Plus, attack on Moscow. Russia calls a drone strike in the capital a terrorist attack.
And March of the Nations.
It's so heartwarming to see our city filled with lovers of Jerusalem.
Christian descendants of Nazis ask forgiveness from survivors of the Holocaust.
All this and more tonight on Faith Nation.
With the debt deadline days away, a push to rally support around a new deal. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm Jenna Browder.
And good evening from our studio in Washington. I'm John Jessup. Well, after weeks of negotiation, now the hard part. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Biden trying to sell their negotiated debt ceiling deal to their respective sides.
Yeah, multiple compromises have ruffled the feathers of members of both parties, threatening the deal's passage. CBN News Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka is on the Hill, where lawmakers have a few more hours to review the legislative text before a vote in the House tomorrow. Matt?
Yeah, John and Jenna, it's basically a game of beg, borrow, and deal right now. That deal struck over the weekend would suspend the debt limit for the next 2 years until 2025, basically meaning the next presidential administration would have to deal with it then. It adds spending caps over the next 2 years. It gets back some of that unused COVID money, rescinds some of the IRS funding, and adds work requirements to some welfare programs. But despite all of that, the most conservative members of the Republican Party, the House Freedom Caucus, right now, they're saying no deal.
I want to be very clear. Not one Republican should vote for this deal. Yes. Not one. If you're out there watching this, every one of my colleagues, be very clear. Not one Republican should vote for this deal. It is a bad deal. No one sent us here to borrow an additional $4 trillion to get absolutely nothing in return.
The Freedom Caucus basically making the case that it doesn't have any significant spending cuts in this deal. Now, Speaker Kevin McCarthy, he kind of sidestepped that criticism. He still believes it's a good deal, admitted that not everybody got everything they wanted, and it's pretty clear he doesn't have every member of his party on board, so he's going to need Democrats to pass this.
Idea that we fought so hard to get those work requirements and welfare reform, or the idea that you can make the president, if he wants to add a new regulation, that now he has to offset that. We haven't had that before. So I'm not sure what everybody wanted. We couldn't get everything we wanted. And when we had this debate, you couldn't talk about the whole budget. So in essence, we were only able to focus on about 11% of the budget. And when the Freedom Caucus talks about wants the spending back to 2022, the non-defense is back lower than 2022. Veterans get more money and defense gets more money.
Now, as for the White House, they're touting the moderate spending cuts and the fact that there would not be a default if this deal goes through. But here's what's going on in the background. Back when Speaker McCarthy was elected Speaker, the chamber had changed the motion to vacate rule, meaning that any member could call for Speaker McCarthy to be removed if they were so inclined or if they were mad enough. Now, if enough Republicans are mad enough about this deal, if they feel like they did indeed get rolled by the Biden administration here, well, this will be the first true test of that motion to vacate rule change. John, Jenna.
All right, Matt Galka on Capitol Hill tonight. Thank you, Matt. To election 2024, with more candidates likely to announce White House bids as early as this week, things are heating up. Meanwhile, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is heading to 3 states in a campaign kickoff that begins tonight in Iowa. DeSantis seizing on the debt limit bill to warn voters over the price of the country's nearly $32 trillion debt.
Prior to this deal, Kaylee, our country was careening towards bankruptcy. And after this deal, our country will still be careening towards bankruptcy.
And after tonight's Iowa kickoff, DeSantis heads to New Hampshire and then South Carolina. The latest polls in the race for the White House show former President Trump way ahead of the pack. Trump has been a top target for DeSantis on the trail.
And with us now is Nathan Gonzalez, editor and publisher of Inside Elections and a Faith Nation contributor. Nathan, always great to see you. So the House is slated to vote tomorrow evening as of right now. Nathan, from where things stand in your situation, do you think the bill will pass?
Yes, you sensed a little bit of a pause there, but let's be optimistic. It sounds like they should want to vote sooner rather than later, because the longer the time goes on, that the more votes they're starting to lose, both Republican and Democratic votes. But it looks like that a compromise, maybe it's a good compromise if you're hearing criticism from the right and from the left. No matter, can they keep those votes, enough votes on the table? And so I'm not a betting man, John and Jenna, but let's say that this thing actually passes.
Yeah. So DeSantis is weighing in on the debt limit fight on the campaign trail. Former President Trump's really stayed pretty quiet lately. Is this going to be a 2024 issue at all, Nathan, or will we just forget about this and not even be talking about it when that time comes around?
Both the primary and the general elections are still a long way away. So if this passes and we avoid significant economic repercussions, I think that there will be other issues that are in the forefront. But for at least a short period of time, this is going to be a top issue. And it's a little tricky, right? Because you're going to see Team DeSantis criticize some of the spending and debt limit decisions that were made in the Trump administration. But you still have Governor Ron DeSantis, a former member of the House of Representatives, who has supported spending in his past, in his congressional record. So it's not a clean-cut issue, but I think you're going to see the two sides tangle over this for at least a little while.
Nathan, we just heard Jenna report a few moments ago that DeSantis is getting ready for a three-state campaign blitz. Of course, he's trying to make up a lot of ground against former President Trump, who has been in for months. What do you think his chances are at winning the nomination? I mean,
Governor DeSantis is the top non-Trump candidate in the race right now. But as you have pointed out, this race does not start. Everyone is not starting from the same starting line. President Trump is starting, 30 yards ahead in this running race, and everyone has to play catch up, or Trump has to be pulled back and pulled down. And so that dynamic is one to watch. And there are going to be more candidates, right? I'm interested to watch former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. I don't think Chris Christie is going to be the nominee, but if he gets into the race, he's not going to be afraid to get in the mud with Trump and to really mix it up, and we'll see what impact that has on this race.
Yeah, Nathan, just a few seconds left, but from the Oval Office to the broader fight for the Senate in 2024, Inside Elections is pointing to an East Carolina University poll showing Governor Jim Justice with a 22-point lead over incumbent Senator Joe Manchin in West Virginia. Just a quick thought on that.
Yeah, this is big. Manchin hasn't announced whether he's running for re-election. This poll shows it may not matter whether or not he runs or not. He's going to have a tough race against Justice, and this would be the first seat the Republicans would need on the path to getting the Senate majority in 2024.
All right. Nathan Gonzalez with Inside Elections. We always appreciate your time and your insight. Thanks, Nathan.
Thanks. Good to see you guys.
Turning overseas, an escalation in the war between Russia and Ukraine, with both countries' capital cities taking attacks. In Moscow, a drone strike marks the city's first real exposure to the fighting.
And residents of Kyiv, meanwhile, are cleaning up after the fourth attack in just 2 days. CBN national security correspondent Caitlin Burke is following the latest. Caitlin, how is the Kremlin responding tonight?
John, Jenna, Russia is calling the incident in Moscow a terrorist attack. Defense ministry officials claiming the interception of at least 8 drones before they hit their targets. Russia Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov threatening to take, quote, the most severe measures yet against Ukraine. While that government continues to deny responsibility, one presidential advisor did admit he was pleased to observe the attacks and predicted more to come. Meanwhile, Russia continues its recent bombarding of Kyiv. A rare daytime attack Monday, sending residents running for shelter. Following at least 17 attacks on the capital this month alone, Kyiv's mayor Vitaly Klitschko says the barrage isn't causing the blow to morale he believes Putin is after.
Putin needs Ukraine without Ukrainians. It's terrorism.
It's everyone is, of course, worried about that, and Russians want to bring depression to our people. Instead, depression, people very angry.
As Russia ramps up the missile and drone attacks, the commander of Ukrainian armed forces says a long-awaited counteroffensive is coming. Over the weekend, he posted this video to Twitter showing troops preparing for battle using Western vehicles, artillery, and rocket launchers. The caption reading, "The time has come to take back what belongs to us."
Україно, рідна земля мати, Господь, Отець наш Небесний, благословіть наш рішучий наступ, нашу священну помсту, нашу святу перемогу.
Meanwhile, the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council is holding his cards close to the vest, saying the counteroffensive could come, quote, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, or in a week. John, Jenna?
All right, Caitlin, thank you very much. Coming up, impeachment in the Lone Star State. Why a Trump ally is facing corruption charges.
Welcome back. The fate of the Lone Star State's top law enforcement officer rests in the hands of the Texas Senate after members of the Texas House voted to impeach and suspend Attorney General Ken Paxton over allegations of bribery, abuse of office, and obstruction. The Texas lower chamber, dominated by Republicans, voted 121 to 23 to approve 20 articles of impeachment. A Senate trial for the close ally of former President Trump will happen sometime before the end of August. Permanently removing the Attorney General and banning him from running again requires the support of 2/3 of the state Senate.
Meanwhile, a push to put chaplains in Texas public schools could become law. The Texas legislature recently passed a bill allowing religious chaplains to work in Texas public schools in a counseling role. The measure is now on Governor Greg Abbott's desk awaiting approval. While critics see the move as an assault on the separation of church and state, supporters argue the bill ensures religious freedom. The chaplain bill is just one of a trio of religious-related education bills in Texas. Another mandates classrooms hang a copy of the Ten Commandments. The third would set aside time for staff or students to pray or read the Bible. Jack Jenkins, national reporter with the Religious News Service, has been covering these measures in the Lone Star State. So, you know, on the school chaplain bill, on its face, it's hard to see how this measure would ensure religious freedom for non-Christians. What are some of the concerns here?
Right. So one of the criticisms that's been lobbed throughout at the creators of this bill throughout its journey through the legislature is that while it does allow for chaplains of any faith tradition to occupy the position of chaplain at these schools, in effect, people argue that most of these chaplains will end up being Christian chaplains. And even if they're from another faith, will that adequately protect the faith of various different students, right? And so the arguments throughout have been that this position will be one that will not reflect the religious diversity of the schools. And in addition to that, there were efforts along to try to amend the bill to say that, you know, these chaplains would be trained and licensed in the same way that we find in the military, for instance, where they kind of train them to bar them from proselytization. And those efforts were ultimately defeated throughout the course of this bill, which now allows for school districts to hire unlicensed chaplains to these positions.
So, Jack, along those lines, can you get into the nitty-gritty of the significance between the licensed and unlicensed chaplains, and what type of oversight will be provided for these unlicensed chaplains?
Right. So the bill was amended to institute some elements of background checks, particularly if chaplains have any sort of potential chaplains have any sort of background, issue with regard to sexual abuse, or if they're on a sexual offender registry, though they will be barred from holding these positions. But outside of that, it is left up to the individual school districts to decide what sort of requirements would be used for a chaplain. Now, the framing of this bill initially was to either replace or augment the work of existing school counselors, who often require a master's degree or 2 years teaching in a classroom before they can occupy that position. But as the bill, as it ended up being written and amended and then unamended, the one that's going to the governor's desk now does not require those sorts of things up front the same way it does for school counselors. So It means that whereas there was an attempt to try to amend the bill to use the same sort of requirements used by the Department of Defense, it was an amendment that would have required chaplains who would be filling these roles in these schools to be on a list that was also part of the Department of Defense's list. Those were stripped from the bill after it passed the House. So when people refer to unlicensed chaplains, they are not required to have the same sort of regimen or training or at least oversight that we often find, say, in the military.
Jack, are there any legal challenges this bill could face?
The ACLU of Texas has told me when I was reporting on this that they are mulling a legal challenge, and they said they were in conversation with other groups as well. So I would be surprised if it's not the ACLU of Texas, if at least one other legal group does file a challenge against this bill fairly quickly. It could be on a myriad of grounds that might include First Amendment issues.
All right, Jack Jenkins with Religion News Service. We appreciate your insight and background reporting on this. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
When we come back, a march for forgiveness, helping to atone for the sins of the Holocaust. After this. From Holocaust denial to harassment, vandalism, and violence targeting Jews, reports of anti-Semitism are on the rise. But in Israel, something unexpected is taking place.
And Christians, descendants of Nazis, are asking for forgiveness from Holocaust survivors, their families, and the Jewish people. And they're being met with mercy. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl shows us how this move is leading to unity.
It's so heartwarming to see our city filled with lovers of Jerusalem. Thank you for being here.
Christians from more than 30 nations around the world have gathered in Jerusalem to say from the Holocaust to new life, Shalom, Shalom, Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
The founders of this march are essentially descendants of Nazis. And, you know, to have human beings coming and saying something so awful happened, we're going to spend our lives trying to correct and compensate for that, and to create a movement like that.
I am from a city in which the university is, where Nazi perpetrators, SS murderers were educated and trained, and they were responsible for the death of 700,000 Jews, and that's why we started researching the history of our city.
March of Life founder Jobst Bittner says German families usually don't speak about their Nazi past.
We discovered that only once we're willing to actually speak the truth about the past, we'll be able to take responsibility both for the present and the future. And that's why we decided to give that call to the nations and to call hundreds of thousands to the streets to raise their voices against anti-Semitism, the hatred of Jews, and for Israel.
Bittner, like many in the march, has a personal story.
My own father was an officer in the Wehrmacht, the German army, and he was in France and in northern Africa. And as an officer of the Wehrmacht, he shared in that responsibility for the deportation of Jews, for the murder of Jews.
Now he sees their responsibility is to stand with Israel, especially in times of crisis.
Together with our Jewish friends, hand in hand, we want to walk and stand for Israel, and that's our theme, united to be a light.
Many of us found out that our fathers, great-grandfathers, they were Nazis, they were part of the Shoah, they were concentration camp guards, they were part of the Wehrmacht.
Heinz Roy's family shared a mixed past. While his Dutch great-grandmother hid Jews in her home, his German-Austrian great-grandfather took a different path.
Because he was part of the Lutheran church that was not supporting Hitler, so I thought, okay, everything was okay. But then I started to read his diaries and his letters. And what I found out is that he withdrew from his Jewish friends at that time. So he didn't speak up. He just didn't want to have anything to do with that. And that's the problem, because at that time, people who knew better didn't do anything.
The March of Life began as a movement of repentance.
We realized that the same silence towards the Jewish people, it's also in our own hearts. And in 2007, we learned that there were 8 concentration camps around our little town of Tübingen in southern Germany. And there were death marches at the end of the war towards Dachau. And then we had the impression, and actually a word from the Lord to say, why not do a March of Life on these trails of the death march?
They walked 300 kilometers, retracing the steps along those different routes over 3 days.
And we had reconciliation meetings in the middle of it and beautiful encounters between the descendants of the Nazis and the Holocaust survivors and the descendants of Holocaust survivors.
What they initially saw as a one-time event is now worldwide. Marches have been held in hundreds of cities through 25 countries. In the U.S., it's called the March of Remembrance. Ahead of the Jerusalem event, President Isaac Herzog commended the group for its courage in facing their dark past. He wrote, "Your presence demonstrates unwavering moral support for our nation-state and its people, and the State of Israel welcomes you with open arms."
Well, I know that my grandfathers were part of the army. I don't know much about it, but they were part of the system. I'm happy that I could be a part of this movement, because I know in Germany most people say it's past, it's gone, but that's not true. It's part of our heritage.
I can take a stand for the past, the present and the future with being part of the march.
Global Zionist movement leader Yehuda Glick welcomed the marchers, saying he hopes to see many more visiting and standing with Israel in the future.
Now it's the time to raise the banner of God on the place that he chose in Zion. It's time for the nations, just like we, the Jewish people, took our destiny in our hands and came back home. Now the nations have to stand up for Zion and make sure Zion is a house of prayer for all nations.
In a powerful show of support less than 80 years after the Holocaust, the March of Life sang the Aaronic blessing over the Jewish people and Israel. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Thank you, Julie. And practicing patriotism by honoring the memory of our veterans. Next on Faith Nation.
Well, across the country, some families spent Memorial Day weekend visiting the tombstones of loved ones and honoring the memory of those who served in our armed forces.
One cemetery caretaker in Pennsylvania is going above and beyond the call of duty to make sure all of the fallen soldiers are properly remembered. Caretaker William Bray cleans and resets tombstones at the historic Brush Creek Cemetery in North Huntington, Pennsylvania. He says it's a way of learning history, researching stones that need some TLC, and giving them a facelift. Bray started a Sponsor a Stone program, bringing in donations to help cover the costs of material and repair. His passion and patriotism fueling his mission to restore headstones to their former glory. That is beautiful.
And what a selfless worker he is.
Yeah. Great to see. Did you have a good Memorial Day?
I did. I didn't do much. I got a lot of rest. I did take some time at 3 o'clock yesterday just to have that moment of silence and remember the people who have fallen in service. So what about you?
Yeah, it was great. We were up in Massachusetts. That's where my husband's from, and so it was great to see family, and yeah, wonderful. And again,
a nice unofficial start of summer.
Yeah, and thank you to all of our service members.
Absolutely. Thanks for watching.
Have a great night.